Video by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, EIS Media Group.
Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Monday, December 22nd, 2025. The time is 3:46 p.m. and I am in Miami, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection, Part 5, Radius of Operations. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll have you know that I typically do these lectures outdoors, but today I'm doing this lecture in Dolphin Mall, and it is fairly crowded today, so I may have to raise or project my voice in various intervals to drown out the background noise. So please adjust your volumes accordingly. I'd like to start this lecture off by reading a number of articles on the terrorism situation in Cuba, particularly those matters that have transpired over the past month. And we'll use these articles as a starting off point for the rest of the lecture, which may or may not be disrupted by third parties who don't want this information to get out. I mean, this is sensitive information regarding Cuba, and mind you, ladies and gentlemen, the county that I live in, which is Miami-Dade County, in its totality is 60% Cuban. So my stalkers, being mostly of Cuban descent, particularly those who know what I do, know what I talk about, and know what I assert, will probably send operatives, liaisons, and stalkers to my exact table. I'm in the food court now, in various intervals to attempt to disrupt my lecture. It doesn't change a thing. Cuba has been on and off the American terrorist radar for 43 years. And whether or not my lectures on Cuba with respect to its terrorist construct gets out doesn't change a thing. It's still a state sponsor of terrorism, and that's a matter of public record. So we're going to get into some articles concerning this. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, gang stalkers are notorious for attempting to make it look as if their targets are taking orders from them. So if there's a third party watching right now, there may be an attempt to demonstrate to that third party that I am in some capacity under the direction of my stalkers, or that I listen to them or take signals from them. But ultimately, it's all deceit and trickery. Gang stalkers have lots of annoyance and pestering tactics that they use to people to try and steer them in this direction or that as they try to get away from them. And they also have lots of technology at their disposal to attempt to forge a scene where it looks as if a targeted person is obeying them or taking orders from them or something to that effect. But it's really a big dog and pony show. It's a light show, and it has no basis in reality or fact. And quite frankly, it's just another tactic that these state-sanctioned pesterers use to try and assert their authority over a target, because ultimately their mentality is, well, we don't care if the target doesn't like us, we don't care if the target doesn't want to be near us, we don't care if the target has no desire to be close to us in any capacity. We're an authority over the target, and us being in authority over the target supersedes their desire for us to be around him or not. So you get these state-sanctioned pesterers. It's really pathetic, ladies and gentlemen. They want desperately for me not to say what I'm saying, but as I said before, whether or not I say these things, particularly concerning the Cuba situation, it's already out there. It's already in the news. It's already in the public sphere. So it's not like this information is not going to get out anyway. I choose to relay this information to my viewers because I have the First Amendment right to do so, and quite frankly, I think it's quite a horrible thing that Miami-Dade County is mostly inhabited by persons that are ethnically, historically, and linguistically tied so very deeply and so very closely to an island country 94 3/4 miles away from Miami-Dade County that is a state sponsor of terrorism. I find that to be deeply troubling, and even more troubling is the fact that in my gang-stalking campaign in particular, I've been surveilled very closely over the past 8 years during my sojourn in Miami-Dade County. And it's to where a lot of my stalkers know what my next move is going to be because they've surveilled me so many times that they know what my proclivities are. Furthermore, a lot of them are wearing earpieces and are getting a live feed from a third party as to where to go, when to go, what to say, when to say it, when to make a move and when not to make a move, all in the interest of attempting to make it look as if I'm following orders from them, which I'm not. It's a light show. It has no basis in reality, and it has no basis in anything that is noble or able to be documented as a fact. So please keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Gang stalkers are constantly sending and receiving signals to one another. They're constantly sending and receiving verbal commands to one another. They're constantly looking for targets. And once a target is pointed out, they immediately descend upon him like a pack of wild hyenas. And again, when third parties tune in, when third parties chime in, there is a constant push or campaign to demonstrate to that third party that the target is under their control and answers to them. But mind you, again, it's a matter of them knowing your moves beforehand from constant surveillance, and a combination of that and them wearing earpieces and getting third-party messages as to the target's whereabouts and how to make it look as if this person is following signals. They just simply have been monitoring me for so long that they know typically what I may or may not do before I do it, and attempt to use that knowledge to demonstrate to third parties that they know what I'm going to do because they're telling me what to do. But I can promise you, ladies and gentlemen, these are not the lectures of a man who is going to come to Miami-Dade County and take orders from people. I am my own boss. I'm my own man. And even though these persons, a lot of them, the gang stalkers themselves, use all kinds of manipulation and tactics to make it look as if I'm taking orders from them, I can assure you that I am not. And again, they will try very desperately to attempt to disrupt this lecture as it progresses. Not necessarily because they think that it will change the situation in Cuba with respect to it being labeled a terrorist state sponsor, but it will give them a sense of comfort that they were able to temporarily pester somebody that is getting the word out. So, having said that, I'm going to read the first article. It's from Newsweek, and the article is just over a month old, and it reads: the Cuban regime's actions go further. They shelter U.S. fugitives wanted for serious crimes by letting these criminals live freely in Cuba, encouraging violence that stretches from U.S. cities to Colombia's mountains. The dictatorship also runs online attacks, spreads false information, and works with countries like Iran and North Korea, making these threats worse by mixing terror with economic pressure. The communist regime's role in Russia's war against Ukraine makes things even clearer. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, thousands of Cubans have been sent to fight for Russia as mercenaries. Some estimates say that the number of Cuban fighters within Russian ranks could be as high as 20,000. The Cuban dictatorship denies involvement, but experts say this couldn't happen without the government's approval. By supporting Russia's attacks, bombing Ukrainian schools and hospitals, Cuba is fueling a war that's a form of state-backed terror, hurting innocent people far away. The U.S. recognized this threat and returned Cuba to the terrorism sponsor list, citing its meddling in Venezuela and beyond. It is now time for the rest of the free world to speak the truth about this barbaric regime. This is why we push for governments across the world to acknowledge that the Cuban regime is a state sponsor of terrorism, as stated in our written declaration in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So what we see in this first article is we see the stark reality of Cuba's terroristic reach. It's not just in Cuba, it's in Cuba, it's in the United States, and it's in Ukraine. Now, I'm not particularly of the mindset that what Russia does is terroristic. They have invaded a foreign country, just as many countries have invaded foreign countries over the past, we'll say 500 years. It's happened a lot through the trajectory of humankind. But what they're saying is that Russia has purchased up to 20,000 Cuban mercenaries to help in the effort. Now, this raised some eyebrows in the United States' executive branch because, for one, Ukraine is, for all intents and purposes, an ally of the United States. And for Cuba, a country just under 100 miles away from Miami-Dade County, to send mercenaries, those are paid soldiers, to Ukraine to fight on behalf of Russia, that raised eyebrows because, for one, Cuba has been on the state-sponsored terrorism watch list and on and off this list for 43 years now. So for them to send mercenaries, 20,000 in number, to Russia to help prosecute a war that America sees as against its own interests, this is going to force the United States to take action against Cuba. And decisive action at that. And I think that contribution to Russian efforts is what helped land Cuba back on the United States' state-sponsored terrorism list. So according to this article as well, it's saying that Russia is bombing schools and hospitals in Ukraine. Again, this is a typical act of war belligerence with respect to the theater of war. Okay, in the theater of war, structures are destroyed. That is the nature of the theater of war, particularly that theater that involves the use of explosives. So it's not uncommon for belligerents in a military conflict to use explosives on the structures of the enemy. That in itself may or may not be a terroristic act, depending on if there are civilians inside of these hospitals. Now, it's a situation where, because Cuba has been constantly on and off this state sponsor of terrorism list since 1982, it's a situation where their image in the West is already volatile. It's already a volatile thing. Okay, and quite frankly, terrorism is in the DNA of the Cuban state. I mean, it is an actual component of Cuban governmental operations. So there's really no divorcing the two. I mean, if you were to divorce Cuba from state-sponsored terrorism and harboring fugitives and sponsoring and enabling various acts of terrorism across the globe, that country would collapse politically and economically, because much of its economy is wrapped up in terrorist causes, because the taxpayer of Cuba, whether they know it or not, is financing terrorism, because the money that's taken out of their income and sent to their federal establishment is being used to finance terrorism. So that makes the citizens of Cuba, whether they know it or not, whether they like it or not, unwitting financiers of terrorist actions. So essentially, there's a problem with Cuba with respect to meddling in Vietnam. It's difficult to know what the cause and the nature of that meddling is. There are ongoing investigations left and right as to what it is that's happening with Cuba and Venezuela. And as a matter of fact, there was actually a news article that I read recently in which the United States Navy hijacked a Venezuelan vessel that apparently had some Cuban terrorists on it. And in response to that, the Cuban government said that what the United States did was an act of maritime terrorism. And I disagree with that. Venezuela is not on a state sponsor of terrorism list. I mean, they're not exactly allies of the United States, but they are a concern. The United States believes that Venezuela is being used as a jumping off point for terrorist activity coming out of Cuba. Alright, so we're going to move on to the next article. And this is actually part 2 of the Newsweek article. I'm going to read it to you. In Cuba, where vibrant streets hide daily struggles, the government silences its people and spreads trouble worldwide. For 60 years since the revolution, the regime has crushed free speech at home and backed violent groups abroad. There's clear evidence that Cuba supports terrorism, yet many countries hesitate to act. Calling Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism isn't just a label, it's a vital step to stopping their dangerous actions and protect democracies everywhere. The proof is undeniable. Since the 1960s, the Cuban dictatorship has supplied weapons, training, and safe hideouts to rebel groups causing chaos in Latin America. Groups like the FARC and the ELN in Colombia, labeled terrorists by the United States and Europe, have relied on Cuban communist support for decades. The Cuban regime has hosted talks for one of these groups, but not as an honest broker. They shielded leaders even after a 2019 bomb attack in Bogota, Colombia, that killed 22 people and injured 60. Cuban communist agents even work inside Venezuela's government, propping up its dictatorship and creating a hub for criminals. So what we see in the second part of this news article is an even more in-depth and an even more stark reminder and expose as to what you might describe as Cuban terroristic criminality in the Latin world. It's saying here that the Cuban regime since the 1960s has provided weaponry, training, stratagem, support, political protection, state protection, economic influence, and cash to terrorist groups in Colombia. And you know, when you add 2 and 2, okay, on this, okay, it basically makes the state of Cuba essentially a state-sponsored dope smuggler. Colombia is known for its large reserves of cocaine or cocaine, and if you take a state sponsor of terrorism like Cuba, and you factor in its capacity to shield known terrorist organizations in Colombia, the only thing that points to, okay, is the state-enabled protection of drug runners, gun runners, human traffickers. Okay, those persons that their business generates a lot of cash. Okay, and cash is not always traceable. And there's no doubt in my mind that the Cuban officials are getting kickbacks from these drug runners, from these gun runners, from these human traffickers for protecting their activity. Okay, Cuban officials are getting monthly stipends from drug runners, human traffickers, okay, and human smugglers. They're getting kickbacks from these organizations in exchange for protection. Okay, that's what's happening in Colombia. So, essentially, there was a 2019 bomb attack somewhere in Bogota, Colombia, and 22 people were killed and 60 were injured. The perpetrators of that mass murder, okay, that terrorist attack, were shielded by Cuban officials perpetually, even to the present day. All right, this kind of stuff does not get past America's eye. Okay, ultimately, the United States, even though in many respects it's not very apparent, the United States has a very wide, we'll call it a national security wide-angle lens across the Pacific and across the Atlantic, and is pretty much able to anticipate and intercept any drugs, particularly narcotics, that come across the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. And because of that wide-angle lens, okay, that figurative wide-angle lens that the United States has, when it comes to things like shielding narco-terrorists, which the Cuban regime has done for 43 years now, the United States sees that. All right, the United States has a vast national security network, and I know from experience that it has a vast national security network because that national security network has been instrumental in prosecuting my gangstalking campaign and the gangstalking campaign of my significant other, Lori. So this wide-angle national security lens is pointed right at Cuba. And the United States has no problem at all seeing the shielding of narco-terrorists that the Cuban state has shielded for 60 years now. So this article, it closes by saying that Cuba has effectively infiltrated Venezuela politically to the point where it has the ability to actively manipulate Venezuelan affairs. And it's difficult to know what the full extent of that manipulation is. And I, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, will keep you updated on these developments as time goes on. All right, this is another article. This is from the Telegraph, which is based out of the United Kingdom. The Telegraph, along with the Daily Mail, the BBC, and others, is a very reputable and well received and well-respected newspaper. This article was written on December 19th, so just 3 days ago. So the head of this article, the header of this article is "Infant Mortality Soars in Cuba as U.S. Terror Designation Hits Public Health." And then the subheader says that doctors say that Trump's decision has spooked international banks and suppliers, disrupting imports of vital medicines and equipment. So, just based off the header alone, what we're seeing is a very diabolical series of events that is unfolding in Cuba. What you have is you're seeing since the Cuban state has been redesignated as a state sponsor of terrorism, you're seeing infant deaths soar. And what Cuba is saying is, well, the United States is directly responsible for the stark increase in the deaths of Cuban infants because it designated us as terrorists. And because we're now designated as terrorists, we're having trouble getting medical equipment and medicines for hospitals. And as a result of that, we're seeing an increase in infant mortality. That's America's fault. That's the United States' fault. The United States is responsible directly for the deaths of Cuban infants because it designated us a terrorist. That is really what the Cuban government is trying to pass off right now as a legitimate news story. And I think it's disgusting. It is beyond anything that I've ever seen a country do to try and deflect attention from its terrorist activity and rather place make the messenger of that activity to blame. This is totally below anything I've ever witnessed before. The article reads as such. It says infant mortality in Cuba has almost doubled since 2018, and as renewed U.S. sanctions take their toll on the island's fabled healthcare system, doctors and aid workers say. The infant mortality rate has surged 85%. From 4 per 1,000 live births in 2018 to 7.4 per 1,000. So what that means is that in 2018, the infant mortality rate was basically 4 deaths per 1,000 live births. And now the infant mortality rate, since Cuba was redesignated as a state sponsor of terrorism, is 7 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. And this is according to the United Nations. And the article continues. It comes as a major outbreak of mosquito-borne disease, including dengue and chikungunya, which has overwhelmed hospitals that were already struggling with shortages of medicine, staff, and basic supplies. Doctors say that Donald Trump's decision to return Cuba to the list of state sponsors of terrorism in January has created a crisis, harming the country's ability to import vital medicines and equipment by spooking international banks and suppliers. And I'd like to stop right there for a second because that's sort of the root of what it is that I've described as a disgusting, disgusting thing that the Cuban regime is doing right now. What it's saying is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to blame Donald Trump's government for the stark rise in Cuban infant deaths. What they're saying is that, well, Donald Trump and his government has classified Cuba once again as a state sponsor of terrorism. So what's happening as a result of that is Cuba is now having problems importing vital medicines and equipment because international banks and suppliers are not giving Cuba the support that they once had because of that terrorist designation. And they're saying because of that, the quality of healthcare in Cuba has suffered, and you are seeing almost double the number of infant deaths now than you did in 2018. And they're trying to blame Donald Trump for that, and I think that that is horrifying, weaselly, cowardly, dumb, and disgusting. And the reason I think that is because, first of all, if Cuba would stop sponsoring terrorism and harvesting terrorists and financing terrorism and carrying out terrorist activities in Colombia and and Venezuela and harboring fugitives that are suspected of terrorist activity, then that label, a state sponsor of terrorism, would have never been placed upon Cuba to begin with. So really what it comes down to is, this label, of state sponsor of terrorism, it puts Cuba on the defensive. And it's only it's only defense as of right now is I've seen two instances. The first instance was the one that I mentioned earlier in the lecture, where the United States, its Navy, it sent a warship into Venezuelan waters to essentially disrupt a Venezuelan water vessel that was possibly being used for narco-terrorism from the Cuban state. And Cuba accused the United States of maritime terrorism for having disrupted that boat. So that was the first solid example of defense, of political defense, that I saw coming from Cuba. And then the second, this article here is the second instance of political defense that I've seen coming from Cuba. And it's essentially the Cuban regime saying, listen, this label, this state sponsor of terrorism label that the United States has placed on us off and on for 43 years now, it's causing us medical problems. It's causing us problems in our hospitals. It's causing us financial problems because now international banks and international hospital suppliers are not doing business with Cuban hospitals in the same capacity that they were before the U.S. establishment labeled Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. So what they're saying is that the international suppliers, because mind you, hospitals in Cuba are nationalized, which means that they are owned by the Cuban government and they are not private hospitals. Like, for example, we have in the United States, we have a combination of private and public hospitals. But in, for example, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, China, Vietnam, Russia, countries that have a communist political structure, the hospitals in these countries are nationalized. They are owned by the federal government. And when they do business with private suppliers or private banks or hospital equipment companies that sell hospital equipment to hospitals, one of the things they look at is your standing in the greater world. So with respect to Cuba, they're saying that because the United States has labeled it once again as a state sponsor of terrorism, that they are having difficulty doing business with international banks and hospital suppliers. And because of that, the infant mortality rate in Cuba has gone from 4 per 1,000 births to 7 infant deaths per 1,000 births. And the reason that that's happening, according to Cuba, is because they are not able to give mothers in labor the same quality of hospital care that they were able to give them before the Trump administration relabeled them as a state sponsor of terrorism. So that is the conundrum that the Cuban government has painted with respect to its infant mortality, and I will continue. Rob Miller, the director of Cuba Solidarity Campaign, said that the country's public health system has deteriorated dramatically, and that medical staff is struggling against the odds. The consequences are particularly visible in overstretched pediatric cancer wards, where shortages of crucial chemotherapy drugs have caused a rise in preventable deaths. More than 70% of essential medicines, over 460 drugs, are currently unavailable in state pharmacies and health centers. Even basic items like syringes, gauze, and antibiotics are getting harder to come by, while aging medicines are breaking down due to a lack of spare parts. So the article continues beyond the increase in infant mortality rates. It's saying that the general quality of healthcare in Cuba altogether has gone down because of the lack of business that the Cuban government is able to do with international healthcare suppliers because of this state sponsor of terrorism designation. So what it's saying is that 70% of essential medicines are being restricted and have run into shortages in Cuba, because it's a situation where, so if you're a pharmaceutical company, okay, an international pharmaceutical company, and you manufacture medicines that hospitals need to administer to patients, you manufacture the medicines, okay, then you sell them to a third party, then that third party sells them to hospitals, and then the hospitals are able to administer them to the patients. What we're seeing here is, we're seeing that as a third party, Cuba as a state is having difficulty importing essential medicines from some of the top pharmaceutical companies, because a lot of these companies refuse to do business with a country that has been labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism. So ultimately, the quality of healthcare in Cuba has fallen dramatically because of this designation, but it all comes back to the central theme of this, and that is, it's time for Cuba to realize, okay, that there are consequences for its actions, okay? It's time for Cuba to grow up as a country, okay? The days of Cuba being able to participate in narco-terrorism, harboring fugitives, meddling in Venezuela, participating in illegal immigration, robbing its taxpayers and not giving them the support and the business resources and the personal resources and the state supplied resources that they need to be successful are over. Okay? Cuba needs to consider that if it continues this behavior, the United States is going to react, and pharmaceutical companies are going to react in kind. So me personally, if I'm the president of Cuba, for example, and I have a cabinet, and we have a head of the Treasury, we have a central bank, I'm trying to clean up the country right now, okay, so that we can continue to have good health care, and so that we can continue to have a high standard of living for the Cuban citizens. But until that day happens, Cuba is going to have a difficult time importing medicines from pharmaceutical companies who have a problem with doing business with a state sponsor of terrorism. So this is going to take us to the next article. This article is from December 15th, about a week ago. This is a Reuters article. It says that Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez lashed out at the decision by the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, saying it was based on lies. It's worth reminding him that agents of his own country in 2024 presented evidence to the contrary, Rodriguez said on X late Tuesday. The Biden administration officials the previous year took Cuba off the list, citing the resumption of law enforcement cooperation between Cuba and the United States as one of the reasons why the previous designation was deemed no longer appropriate. The Cooperation Against Terrorism list, which the State Department is required by law to provide the U.S. Congress, is not the same as the state sponsor of terrorism list. Joe Biden has also removed Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list, but Trump promptly reversed the decision upon taking office, imposing harsh new sanctions on the Caribbean island nation. The State Department on Tuesday also recertified North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela as countries that failed to cooperate with the United States in its counter-terrorism efforts. The non-cooperation certification results in a prohibition on the sale or license or export of defense articles and services to these countries. So essentially what this article is saying is that there is a stark and penetrating divide between Cuban foreign ministers and the judgment of the Trump regime. The sitting Cuban foreign minister is saying that Marco Rubio, who is a Cuban American and the Secretary of State for the United States, is an erroneous judgment and is by proxy an error of judgment. It's saying here that they're just basically just talking about how offended they are that the Trump administration has decided to put Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list, having reversed the decision by Joe Biden to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list. And I want to get into some as to what the previous president of the United States, Joe Biden, what his motivation was for taking Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list in the first place. It was politically motivated, okay? Now, I'm not faulting the Democrats or the Democrat Party for favoring Latino voters, okay? Latino voters are high in number in this country, and there are many persons in this country of Latino descent, or rather of the Latino ethnic heritage, that are directly affected by illegal immigration, which the Democrats have taken a more lenient approach to than the Republicans. and it's a way for the Democrats to secure more voters, particularly the Latino voters or the Hispanic vote, by showing that it is willing to be lenient to persons who enter into this country illegally. And at one point there was a very strong push by the Democrat Party, particularly during the Obama administration, to offer amnesty to these persons, and that was a very hot topic and a very hot debate back in the late 2000s to mid 2010 range, about that 7-year period from about 2009 to 2016. There was a push to sort of normalize the idea of illegal aliens coming into this country with no documentation at all, and getting driver's licenses and government benefits. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know, the sociological, the socio-political, the ethnic, the racial, the linguistic landscape of this country has it's shifted. It shifted quite a bit, and there's really no end to the madness, and there's no method to the madness either. When you get Democrats in office at the executive level, they're going to have a capacity to be more lenient to illegal migrants in an effort to woo Hispanic and Latino voters, while making voters out of the illegal aliens that become citizens because of amnesty. And you're going to see in times where we have a Republican head of state and a Republican Congress, you're going to see less of a capacity to tolerate illegal immigration, because, quite frankly, Republicans are more nationalistic in that respect than Democrats are. Republicans simply believe that we're a nation of laws, and despite people wanting to be compassionate and loving and kind and caring and generous and free-spirited and all of these things, we're still a country of laws, and you're going to have to you're going to have to come to this country. You're going to have to come to this country the right way, because there's no telling. I mean, if you get illegal immigrants into this country, you don't know how many of them are terrorists. You don't know how many of them are criminals. You don't know how many of them have diseases that they want to spread here in the United States. And you really have no clue as to what they're capable of, or who they could harm, or who they could hurt. So, with respect to illegal migration, I've always been in favor of the Republican platform more. I was a huge backer of the wall that Donald Trump wanted to build, even though that wall, if I'm not mistaken, the completion of that wall was halted when President Trump was replaced in office by President Joe Biden. But ultimately, the wall stands partially completed, and it would be nice to see that wall fully built to get the point across that this is a nation that prefers legal migrants to illegal migrants. I would like to go ahead and close it there. It is a very stark, very perplexing topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I will continue to report on this topic. It is an important topic to me as a resident of Miami-Dade County. Me personally, I've never traveled to Cuba, and neither have most Americans. I mean, it's a very restricted area, and quite frankly, the only private institution that I can think of that has any kind of access to Cuba at all is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it would be nice to see our elected officials sort of get in the church's face and say, hey, look, the Trump administration has just designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. We know you have exclusive access to Cuba. We know that you have extensive operations in Cuba. We know that you have lots of church members that are of Cuban and Cuban American descent. And we need you to act on behalf of the United States federal government and tell us what you know about the situation there. Okay? Because ultimately, there's no... it's a mysterious state. It's a mysterious place. It's a mysterious regime to the typical American. And, in the interest of national security, I mean, look, when you talk about clandestine gang-stalking campaigns, you're talking about what I consider to be a frivolous use of taxpayer resources and of national security and intelligence resources to disrupt the lives of U.S. citizens clandestinely. Okay? My thinking is this. Take your hands off the U.S. citizens that are presently targeted individuals. Okay? Use those national security resources to investigate just what it is that's going on in the Cuban state and make sure that none of that activity has spread to the United States. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you right now, okay, as a person who has lived in Miami-Dade County for a period of 8 years, there are terror cells here in Miami-Dade County that pose as dope smugglers, they pose as drug runners, they pose as pimps, they pose as business owners, okay? They pose as a lot of things. There's a lot of money laundering going on here in Miami-Dade County, and there's no doubt in my mind that the Cuban government has some hand in that money laundering. Okay, and what we must understand, what we must realize, is that when it comes right down to it, you have a system here, right? You have the capitalist system here. You have free market capitalism here. Okay, the markets determine, the consumer behavior drives the markets here. Okay, business innovation and growth drives the markets here. Okay. And we have a population of 311 million people that are subject to that capitalist ideology that has been the central political philosophy, or rather the central economic philosophy of this country for 200 years now. So and then right across 100 miles from here, okay, you have an island state, okay, that is communist. Okay, the consumer behaviors don't drive the markets. The federal government drives the markets. And on top of that, it's a government, it's a country, it's a regime that is guilty of narco-terrorism and human trafficking. So you have that kind of activity happening just 100 miles from where we are. You have a gigantic church right in the middle of all that action. They refuse to open their mouth as to what they know. Okay? What are their investigations into the matter? What are their investigations into the narco-terrorism? Ultimately, we can never know what is happening beyond FBI reports and CIA reports, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has chosen to keep quiet on the matter. So A lot of this does fall on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints' shoulders. It just does. Because ultimately, having such a political influence in Cuba, an economic influence in Cuba, a social influence in Cuba, a theological influence in Cuba is growing rapidly in Cuba right now. And no doubt the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with its vast resources, its vast resources in 200 countries. It has a net worth of $2 trillion. It's got several hundred thousand or even several million members that worked in the armed forces and the intelligence and federal law enforcement agencies. Of course, they have spies all throughout Cuba. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints almost definitely has spies all throughout Cuba. Okay? Turn over that information to the United States federal government, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and do it right this second. Cuba is only 100 miles from here, and it has been labeled as a state sponsor of narco-terrorism and human trafficking. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, turn over your intel on the Cuban state to the U.S. federal establishment, and do it this very second, and do it in the name of democracy. Okay? Turn it over to the Department of Defense. Turn it over to the Department of Justice. Make your presence known. Let the American people know just what it is you're doing in Cuba, and how come you haven't said anything about its state sponsor of narco-terrorism, which is obviously something that the free world needs to know about, but definitely the United States, given its proximity to Cuba. All right, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, turn over your intel, and turn over your intel right now. Turn it over in the name of national security. All right, because ultimately what you're doing is you're shielding terrorism by not telling us what you know. All right, I can guarantee the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has thousands of spies across Cuba and knows more about its narco-terrorism probably than the FBI does. Okay? Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, turn over your information on Cuban narco-terrorism, and turn it over right now in the name of the Constitution. Thank you for tuning in.